Hello, Susan Corbett, here with a feather fest for you today. This quilt is really large and it was hard to get all in one frame, but it's really pretty and the feathers just make it even more pretty. It's machine embroidered, so that part is really gorgeous. The embroidery is really delicate. So I went back and forth with how to quilt around the embroidery. But I knew right off that one of the things I wanted to do on this quilt was feathers, because that's a good way to fill up a lot of space pretty easily. And it seemed like the right thing to do in the floral border fabric. This quilt is designed as a gift for a young woman, and we knew we didn't want to go all out with the quilting. So there's only a little bit of, really dense stuff in here. We just wanted something really nice. So this is my attempt at using some restraint. So there's feathers in the big long borders in this fabric and also in some shorter rectangles in between the embroidery. So as you can see, they're long and graceful, and I've decorated the stem in the middle of all of that. Some feathers are really long and some are really short. I created deep wells with the vine so I could do all different kinds of things in all that space. There's a lot of space in this border. I quilted this quilt with 2 different thread colors. Here in the feathers, I used a slightly darker color than the background of this fabric. I used it here and in the piece borders as well, and then switched to a matching thread in the embroidery. So I'm freehanding the stem, making deep wells. And although the quilt is sort of directional, the quilting is not. I've quilted all of the borders. They kind of, that vine goes in a circle around the whole quilt. So it doesn't matter how you turn the quilt, all the quilting will look the same. So I put in one line of the stem, and then I've gone back to the beginning and started the feathers on one side. This type of feather, you start at the bottom and work your way up to the top. So you could quilt the stem up one side and then go back down the other and get it done right away, but I was already going to have to stop and start here because of the sequence of quilting the feathers. And if I had quilted a border this long in both directions, I don't think the thread would have cooperated. I'm really sure it would have just broken and shredded a whole bunch. In fact, it did on the smaller rectangles where I thought I could get away with that. The thread is So Fine by Superior. So it's a good strong poly, but it's still spindly. To quilt feathers like this, I am making a lot of decisions in the moment. I did not plan out exactly how I wanted the whole thing to go. I knew I wanted there to be all kinds of differences. I put some leaves and some tendrils and, things like that in places to take up some of the space. I added some smaller feathers that kind of go in the opposite direction. That's fun to do. And this came out of years of doing feathers, learning all different kinds of ways to do them, seeing photo after photo of how other people had done them, and just trying things out. So when to stop making large ones and switch to a smaller one, that's just kind of a personal decision. When they start to look ungainly is when I revert to making them smaller. And I like to make them wrap around each other and look like they're in a tight cluster and then unfurling. This is just a whole lot of fun. It looks like they're growing. These go pretty fast, except the totality of quilting all the borders, that adds up. That does take some time. I decorated the stem on these long borders, and I did not do that on the smaller rectangles with the feathers. Just because I thought, it's a nice thing that's really going to show up in the long borders, but I didn't want to spend an inordinate amount of time doing that everywhere, because I was trying not to go all out here. They show up pretty well, but not completely, because this is a print after all. So it's going to be yards and yards of pretty with some parts of it that don't show up as much as others. Another option for a border like this with a printed fabric is to do a bunch of straight lines. That would have been really gorgeous here. But as large as the quilt was, considerable work. That would take up a lot of time. There's reasons we use feathers so much in quilting. They're beautiful, they're malleable, they'll fit in whatever kind of space you want to put them in, and once you've learned how to do them, they go really quickly. I think learning how to freehand a feather will set you free as a quilter. Here on this part of the border, one of the key things to keep in mind is don't get too close to the edge, to where the binding needs to go. And on a lot of feathers, I'd be doing echo quilting or putting in some background quilting. That isn't an option on this particular quilt because we didn't want to go all out. So this border does not go in a circle around the entire perimeter of the quilt. It stops. So you have to figure out how to stop it here, before we run into the next bit of piecing. So that's a stopping point, and now I've got to stop and go back and put in the other half of the stem and then start from the bottom on the other side. Added a flourish to take up some space. And that stem is not perfectly parallel. Number one, I can't do it. And B, it doesn't have to be perfectly parallel. So it's wide enough to handle a decorated stem. And it's not too narrow until it gets right to the very end. I've seen in books all sorts of complicated directions for making it all perfect, and that's not what I do. Freehanding is not perfect. And I've never had anyone complain. It just looks gorgeous all the way around. Now here, one way to get to the other side would be to go ahead and quilt that stem right now. And I think that just kind of slipped my mind this time around, so I didn't. And maybe at this point I had not figured out what I was going to do, or if I was going to do that at all. By this point, I have done a whole lot of quilting and turned the quilt so I could quilt the sides, the two other sides, all at once without having to advance the quilt little by little. So this is the underside of what was a whole different border than the one we just quilted. Here I'm quilting some of the smaller feathers. They go in a whole different direction. It's nice to have different sizes of feathers so that the border does not look static and boring. It's much more interesting to vary the scale of the design elements. And it might look like I'm doing the exact same thing I did earlier, but there's always a whole bunch of little differences in here. Let's zoom in so I can show you that little flourish right there. I learned that years ago from Linda Taylor and love it. It's a great transitional element. It takes up a lot of space. It's gorgeous. It's fun to do. It's one of those things you need to draw first to learn and then put it on a quilt. So it's nice to have a whole body of those little flourishes to put in all kinds of various places. And I used more of those on a smaller scale in the embroidery blocks as well. The batting is Hobbs 80/20, which is that's one of my go-to bats for large bed quilts. If you want to learn how to do feathers and don't know how yet, or you want to expand your feather library, as it were, I would highly recommend buying Linda Taylor's feather books. There are a couple of, well, there's more than, I think she has 4 self-published softcover books with all kinds of feathers in them. Really creative stuff. You can go online and look up Linda's Electric Quilters and find probably 2 or 3 sources, if not more, for those. My mom always said, if you can read, you can cook. And I think if you can read, you can teach yourself how to make a feather. Just get some books and finger trace around all those designs. I think it's just not that hard. Probably the hard part is building a level of comfort, but the only way to do that is to do them over and over and over. And the more experience you have, the more you'll think, man, these are easy. Easy and fun. Really fun. There's the zen of piecing, and then there's the zen of machine quilting, and this will put you in a good place. Notice that the feather starts in one place and ends up in a whole different place. This is one of the things I find that confuses people. If you start and stop in the same place over and over and over, you're going to get a flower, not feathers. And I had one person tell me she was frustrated with feather making because she wants them all to be exactly alike and all the same size, which doesn't make any sense to me at all. There are feathering tools out there that will get you feathers all the same size, but I can't imagine why you would want that. I think it's impractical, and I think that's a hand quilting thing, not a machine quilting thing. If I'd quilted all the feathers the same size here, I'd end up with a whole lot of empty space. It would be, I think, a lot less interesting. So here, how to finish up this section. And this is why it comes out different every time for me, because I change my mind. So my favorite little design for decorating a stem is to do little arcs. It's the simplest and fastest. I mean, decorating a stem takes up a lot of time. So I don't want to spend all kinds of time doing intricate things. And this makes a wonderful texture. It just looks really good. And you want to run your finger up and down that stem a whole lot. You could do any number of things. Little diagonal lines, you could do circles, you could do any little sashing design as long as you can keep it tiny. And it'll be awesome in there. Well worth doing. And if you don't like the inconsistency of your stem, if you think, you know, oh look, got all these little so-called mistakes, this is a good way to divert attention away from what you don't want people to see and embellish at will. To give the eye something else to focus on. That is so pretty. Moving on to the embroidery blocks. Now there's all kinds of stabilizer underneath this fabric. It's not too thick to quilt, it's very doable, but it's kind of crunchy. So I did want to quilt this part to death, and I abandoned that plan, trying to use some restraint. The reason I thought they should be heavily quilted is because the designs are so tiny and delicate, and I think you want proportion. So I'm on the fence about how successful my final plan was here. It's pretty. I don't think it's wrong. I ended up doing more flowers, little bitty leaves, because look how little these are in the embroidery. And then I ended up doing more feathers on a much smaller scale. So we have a cohesive plan. Quilting it went pretty fast. And all these embroidered blocks are a variation on the same thing. So I started out thinking, well, I'll just do a flower meander. This is where you quilt a little tiny flower and then some kind of meandering something in between to get you from one to the other. And then that turned into all kinds of little variations. So I've outlined the embroidery, which I think is the best thing to do. I know lots of people don't go anywhere near the embroidery, and then it just looks awful. So outlining gives you a much more finished look. It's buttoned it down, it's tailored, and I think it makes the embroidery stand up and look really good. So I'm putting in little flowers where there is space for them to go, and then adding little leaves. I did teeny tiny dimensional quilting only in just a few little places that kind of cried out for it. And there weren't very many of those. I mean, I could have done all sorts in between those little branches, but I wanted consistency. And I mean, it's a big bed quilt, so there wasn't going to be any of that anywhere else in the quilt, and I didn't want this stabilized, already stiff fabric to become any more stiff and crunchy than it already is. And I don't think the client's the recipient of this quilt, I don't think will know the difference. Here's where I decided to put in a larger flower with some feathers emanating from either side. The flower is pretty standard. It's one I've used I don't know how many times before. It sort of resembles the one in the embroidery, and I used it all over the quilt, just to keep it simple. And the flower, just like the feather, once you know how to make them, it's not a big deal anymore, and you can just bang those right out. So here's a stem. Wrapping the feather around the petal, making the feathers different sizes, trying to manage the fullness of that background fabric. And I'm tying off so as not to backtrack too much. Plus, taking that little break gives you time to think, what exactly am I going to do next? How do you know how big to make the feather? How much room do you have at any given moment? That dictates how big they're going to be, in part. These can't be too big, or they'll swamp the embroidery, which is the focus. So I don't know. See, that's part of the decision-making dilemma here. Is this the right thing to do? It's a judgment call. And I've run out of bobbin, which gives me a chance to tell you about my favorite new little acquisition. When I got the new long arm, all kinds of little fun toys came with it, including a little bitty brush, which isn't cutting it. So I saw someone using a brush like this online, so I went to a craft store and was looking in the art supplies and found this brush that I am loving. It feels luxurious. It made this onerous little chore less tedious and more enjoyable. It's a painting brush that's called a mop, which is just exactly what I wanted, to mop up all that lint in the bobbin area. It was like $6. I couldn't be more happy with it. I just love it. Okay, so back to that feather. The things that make us happy. feathers get smaller the farther out from the flower they go. So they're sweet and really pretty. So there's a little space left to fill in between elements. So some little tendrils, I think, are the answer. I could have left that part right there blank, but look how it's puffing up. I'm not happy with that at all. I think that's going to look unfinished. So some more little leaves and flourishes are going to handle that problem quite well. What you don't quilt is going to stick right up, so it better be a good-looking thing you leave unquilted. I think that's not perfect, but it's a lot better than it was. Transitioning over to the pieced blocks, what I did was play with one of my new rulers. So I'm doing continuous curves from point to point in these large squares. I have been freehanding these for years and have no problem doing that. But if you use a ruler, they're going to be a lot more precise. And since these are so large, the larger the curve you're trying to put in there, the harder it is to keep the line as smooth as possible. So that's why I chose a ruler for this. And I debated long and hard about whether to do a double continuous curve. Because look at all that space. Look at that huge melon shape at the intersection. At this, at the seam. But I got over it and just left them as singles. So one of the decisions to make here is what color thread. We thought the quilt had enough pink in it that it didn't need pink thread. So I used a cream colored thread and an off-white. So here I'm using the cream because it would be a little bit of a lower contrast than the lighter color would be on these maroon colored fabrics. So I'm always leery of quilting with a highly contrasting thread. I mean, I love quilting with a different color thread if the contrast is fairly low. But a high contrast just calls attention to every little problem, inconsistency, or mistake that comes along. You know, this always makes me really nervous. You get high drama with a highly contrasting thread, but you need to be really, really confident and skilled at what you're doing. So that's looking very, very nice. Okay, and I traveled to the middle, and now I'm putting in larger versions of the same flowers you've seen before in this video. I start with a center circle and then add freehand petals. And I wanted to make it as continuous as possible, so retracing my steps around that arc is a thing I felt comfortable doing on some of these fabrics, but not all of them. So there were a lot of stops and starts. But these go pretty quickly. The contrast will be higher on this fabric. And on this fabric, the contrast will be much higher. You have to just be brave. I could go back and add little details to the petals, but that's not what we're doing on this quilt. On the piano key border, what we decided long ago when this quilt came in was to do some arcs, just as a way to get this quilted without taking up all the time in the world. So this is really easy and fast to freehand. Just do a little arc and then another one. You know, they get bigger and bigger, and then you change directions and take them along some other path. So here the color is going to go in and out. You'll see it really well in some places and not so much in others. In the end, I wish I had chosen some other design to put in here. You know, I think contrast is really important, and the quilting here wasn't quite as different as I would have liked in relation to what was on either side of it. I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just saying, you know, something else artistically would have been better looking. It's still really pretty. See how the quilting looks on that third patch? And now see how it's looking with this burgundy patch. how it really shows up. Now let's quilt one of the narrow borders. This is one of my favorite patterns. It's called Bamboo. It is by Golden Threads, a pattern pack I bought eons ago. The pack is called Bold Beginnings Pack 1 Borders. I don't know if you can still buy this anywhere. It's full of great stuff. So the only trick to this is noticing where it stops. You know, when you go to make the next spike, where do you aim for? What do you come back to? And the pattern pack has instructions on how to turn a corner. And I cheat all the time because, you know, that takes some thought and work. And they've worked out a couple of them, but not all of them. So when I get to the corner, I just turn the corner. Just keep on going without making a mirror image or, you know, coming up with some little trick to redesign it at the corner so it can go in a full circle without requiring any special efforts to get it there. And that looks great in a contrasting thread. A contrasting thread is my favorite thing in a solid color border, or even a print, because it gives you one more way to delight the eye, just one more little cool visual happy place. You just have to watch the stops and starts and, you know, be careful where you run out of bobbin or something so that you camouflage the stops and starts. On this frame, I'm using another design from that same pattern pack. It's really just a big meander, but done in a pattern meander linear kind of form. Boy, it's really fast, and I think it's great as a pattern meander. And it's easy to change the direction, because it does need to change. So see where I've put that pin? That's my center. So that's where I want to start going in a whole different direction, the opposite direction. I think it looks great. I'm not a fan of a big meander in any way, in any form, except in a little frame. I guess I'm just over it. I think there's too many other great designs out there to waste your time with that. And if you want a big meander on your quilt, you're not going to bring your quilt to me anyway. So see, here in the corner, you just keep doing what you're doing. And don't worry about changing directions till you get to the next center. excellent. And onto the quilting of the white border around the medallion. I chose to do lines in threes, and I've talked about this in several other videos. What I want to say about it right now is this was one of the last parts to be done, so look how much fullness there is to fool with. And that's what those pins were in there for, to keep pleats and puckers from forming. And then in the medallion itself, I chose this great little background fill that I love. So that turned out really nice. It's just a bunch of echo. And did some little dense background quilting just in the very centers. That really helps the embroidery. So there is the finished quilt. It turned out really great, and I just love it. And I hope the recipient loves it as much.